Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, first week into the new year, 2023. I can remember a time where after 2000, many folks thought that was the future, so I guess this is what the future looks like, no? New year, new starts, always nice to start fresh on things. I'm really excited about a lot of guests I have on the podcast. Many repeat guests, which is always a joy for me. A lot of new folks that are researchers and writers and scientists and branching out into different things. So I'm really excited about that. Of course, I've been plugging this a little bit. I've gone over to Substack, which has been really nice. I've really enjoyed it. It's a nice way to interact with my audience a little bit more directly, get to see what you guys like, what you don't like. So that's been a lot of fun. So if you haven't already, subscribe over there to convergingdialogues.substack.com. It's free, and it will be free for the foreseeable future. Maybe down the road, we'll kind of do some ways in which we can have more things you can get for, if you contribute or whatever. But for now, it's all still free. You can listen to all the previous episodes that I've released, and you can get all of them wherever your podcasts are as well, or on Substack. So give us a follow. I'm on YouTube as well, so just follow me everywhere, and don't miss any of the episodes. This episode here is with a repeat guest and a friend, Kat Rosenfield. She has a new novel out, which I'm really excited for everyone to hopefully go and get. I read it. It's wonderful. Her previous book was also very good. So her previous book, and the one that we talked about last time she was on, was No One Will Miss Her, which was great. I really enjoyed that one. And her new book is called You Must Remember This. It's another novel, a little bit different genre and style. And so it was a great book. We had a wonderful conversation. As before, Kat is a freelance culture writer, political writer, and a novelist. And she writes at Unheard pretty frequently, and also Reason. And she's just put out this book, which hopefully everyone goes and picks up. So in the conversation, we talked about why she writes novels and also does her, political and cultural and pop culture kinds of writing, and talks about how she kind of sees them as sort of connected. I mean, there are different, obviously, but there's some underlying threads that go there. She talked about why writing a gothic mystery novel was different and how she enjoyed it. We talk about writing strong female protagonists and the quote-unquote Mary Sue characters that are in media. And then we talk about outrage culture and what we can do about it. One of the things that I felt for a while now is that, we do this kind of performative outrage stuff over whatever it is for a couple weeks, and then we forget about it. And, I think we need to be better about that as a society and just think through things a little bit clearly. And, try to not miss the humanity in other people. Kat we talk about it in the conversation, she wrote this fantastic piece, I think it was for National Review, on, why she keeps getting mistaken as a Republican. Again, not that that's a bad thing per se, but it's just interesting. And she talks about it and talks about the piece. And it's just interesting how we keep drawing sides and lines with things, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. And I think we need to be more open to people. We can have principles and values, but we really just have to, I think, be good to each other. Life is very short, and hopefully in this year we can get a little bit better about that as a society and as a culture. All that said, I was really happy to talk with Kat. I love her humor. She's so nice. She's a great writer. And she has a sharp mind, and I like how she approaches things in culture, and how she just tries to, take the edge off of things, and she uses her humor well. And so she's just a wonderful person. And I always love talking to her, and happy about our conversation. So now I bring you Kat Rosenfield. I am here with Kat Rosenfield. Kat, how's it going?
It's very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's very nice to see and hear you again. For listeners, you were on the podcast previously for your former book, or previous book, I should say, No One Will Miss Her, which was fantastic. Doesn't this feel like a long time ago now? This has to feel like years ago.
Yeah, is that a galley you're holding up?
My yes, gosh. It is. Yeah. I have one of these. Yeah. That book was great. Everyone should read that, and you can listen to us talk about some of the themes there. And then the new one, which you just churned it out right afterwards, is You Must Remember This, another galley. Which just came out, or it's coming out. When's it coming out? When's the actual official date?
January 10th.
Okay, January 10th.
So you and I are talking in my busy week leading up to the release. This is my kind of, I'm kicking off my promotional activities by talking to you.
Yeah. Well, it's never ending. I've realized that people, when they're doing a book or they got something coming out, they're always kind of doing all the promotional stuff, podcasts and talks and all these things. So I gather that it's always a busy time. So I do appreciate you coming and talking to me again. We always have a nice chat. So just real quick, for listeners that haven't heard you, just what's your 30-second version of yourself, what you do and what your background's in and what you're interested in.
I am a freelance writer. I'm a columnist at Unheard. My culture writing has appeared in Wired, Entertainment Weekly, The New York Times, Reason Magazine, where I'm also a relatively regular contributor. And then I'm also a novelist. And this is, You Must Remember This is my fifth book. Prior to this, I did write No One Will Miss Her, which was Edgar nominated. Before that, I collaborated with Stan Lee on a sci-fi novel, which was a lot of fun. And before that, I was a young adult fiction writer, which is a world that I have since left behind because of reasons.
Yeah, I'm sure that's its own world, isn't it? That's great. Yeah, and you write all the time. We were talking about it before we got on here, that you're always writing. So I know it's a familiar space. You write so many things. Every time I turn around, you have another piece that you've written, another article. Sometimes it's controversial to some people. Other times, it's well applauded. So I always like your writing. I think it's great. It's always sharp and funny and smart, and so it's always, I like reading the essays, and then I like reading the books. So
thank you. Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that you're enjoying all of it.
Yeah, of course. So you have all this writing you've done, and so I guess I want to start with first is the novels. I guess quickly, you do a lot of different writing. I guess what is it about? So as we said, you just did No One Will Miss Her, which is great, and you have this one. What is it about, writing stories, or the kind of the full length novel, that is so interesting, or you keep coming back to that? You said it's your fifth novel. So what is it about that kind of format that's interesting to you, that you keep coming back to it?
Well, I see my culture writing and my fiction writing as kind of two fruits of the same tree. What's central to novels and also to the work that I do in the culture space is, asking questions about human conflict. And, there's always this question of what are we doing to each other, and why are we doing this to each other? Why do we treat each other the way we do? And who are we to each other? Who are we to ourselves? These things are really interesting to me, and I love unpacking them, from the perspective of analyzing existing cultural products and drawing connections between them, finding little through lines that, can go back many hundreds of years. But I also love to tell my own stories, and I love the freedom of a fictional world, one that's completely of my creation, to explore themes like this, and often to incorporate not just the sort of big questions that that I tackle thematically in books, but also to incorporate things that have been happening in my own life, something that's maybe interested me.
Yeah, it's your stories always feel personal isn't the right way to say it, because that sounds like not autobiographical, but they have a personal feel to it. It doesn't feel too removed. It feels like it feels familiar. I've run into these people, or I've had these people in my lives at some point, the characters you create. So it feels familiar or personal in that way.
Oh, that's a great compliment. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's intentional, but that's how it reads to me, at least. And so, I guess when you're writing it, what's usually like your process? Do you kind of like say, I'm going to write a story about this, or is there like a theme? Like, I want to get these themes in here, and then I'll make the story around it, or the characters. Like, what's your kind of emphasis when you're trying to develop a story?
So the inception of a book is often something really random. I can get an idea from all kinds of places. The previous book, I got a series of ideas from a bunch of different places. One of them was this kind of esoteric German, I think, horror movie called Goodnight Mommy, which came out in like 2015 or something like that. And I don't want to talk too much about that because, I would just spoil the plot. And it's really, it's interesting. It's worth watching. But there were little things in there that kind of started the gears turning. And then also there was this song called No Children by the Mountain Goats that I really got kind of fixated on. I love the idea of telling a story about like a horrible divorce or a horrible end to a horrible marriage where, somebody has to die in order for the relationship to end because it's, gotten that toxic. And then You Must Remember This is my pandemic novel, which is to say that it's really inspired by things that happened to me during the pandemic. The pandemic itself is not in it. But this book is, first and foremost, it's about a dead grandmother. And my grandmother did pass away really early on in the pandemic. And she, like the 85-year-old Miriam Gardner, one of the protagonists of You Must Remember This, she had dementia. She was 105 when she died. Wow. So, very, very long lived. And she and I weren't especially close, but that was not really a problem because towards the end of her life, she didn't remember anything from the past 25 to 30 years. So she didn't really know who I was, and she would never remember that I had been to see her. And the only way to have a relationship with a person who's in that kind of mental place is to just really meet them where they are. And the interesting thing with my grandmother is that when I would visit with her, I wasn't just, letting her direct the conversation, but it was like I was time traveling with her because she had vivid memories of her youth, time, not just before I was born, but, before my mother was born, all of these things that had happened to her, she could talk about like they had happened last week. In some cases, she was really salty about them. Like, I guess in 1932, she applied to be a coat check girl at the Roseland Ballroom in Chicago. And she was rejected because she wasn't pretty enough. And they told her this right to her face. And boy, was she still mad about this. She was so mad, as if it had happened like last week. So that experience of kind of, catching these glimpses of the young woman that my grandmother had been, I was really fascinated by that, by the way that memory is like, it could be a doorway into the past, especially for the person whose memory it is. So there was that. And I wanted to explore that experience more in depth and ask kind of the questions of like, well, what if there were things in your past that you wanted to forget and couldn't, or didn't want to forget and did. So there was that, yeah. And then also, this book takes place at Christmas time, and the real kind of impetus for the opening scene, which is the first one that I developed, was that I was back in my hometown on the Hudson River for Christmas, and it was 2020 December. So it really just felt like there was nobody out. It felt like the world had ended and like I was the last person left alive. I would walk around with my dog and like the streets were empty and it was very foggy. There was this very thick fog coming off the river to the point where I would go for these walks and it was not just as though I were the only person left alive. It was as though anything outside of like a 20-foot radius around where I was standing didn't exist anymore. And I got a little intense about the idea of fog as a metaphor for like memory and getting lost in your own memory. And, I spent a lot of time thinking about my grandmother during this time. So altogether, I became fixated on the image of an old woman walking into the fog and disappearing. And that's really where this book began. Obviously, it's not where it ended. Things get much more complicated. But, that's a good example, actually, of how a sort of a small thing can spark something that turns into a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you say. When I was reading it, I'm reading the story, but then I'm like, I wonder where did this come from? Like, where did these ideas originate? Where did she get the idea to do this or go that way? So it's interesting hearing that the pandemic is not in the book. Thankfully, I actually don't like when we have shows and films and books that are very obviously talking about the pandemic. I don't know, it feels too close, it feels too soon. I think there's different ways you can do that, and so it's nice actually knowing that you did without being on the nose about it. But yeah, using the idea of, different types of relationships, a past version of oneself. How do you have interactions with people in different times? It wasn't I haven't read your other books, but in the previous one, it was kind of just like kind of pretty straightforward, I guess, more or less. And this one flips back and forth in time, which is really cool. And I've seen, obviously that's not a new thing. Obviously other books do that, but I think sometimes I can imagine that's tricky to do from a writing stance, right? Because when you're writing that way, sometimes the reader will get confused, or maybe it's hard to like kind of keep things in a kind of a alignment of sorts of like, okay, is this in this time or is this in this time? Or who's somebody that does that? Stephen King's done this, right? And he did this with in It, right? And it's just like it's all over the place, right? I actually don't. I mean, I know people like It and stuff, but I don't particularly. I don't like the book. I just don't like how it's organized because it's a lot of back and forward in time, and they're older and they're younger, and so I didn't feel that way with this. It felt very kind of fluid. It's like, again, with the whole idea of like memory and a person, and it was like always like kind of illustrating a particular point in the present day part of the story. But I guess how was that writing it or telling it? It makes sense based on the content of the story, but how was that kind of writing that piece of it?
It was surprisingly intuitive, actually. As soon as I realized that I wanted to have these dual timelines, and I didn't know that at the very start, and then I got the idea that. So, for those who have not read the book, just like a little overview, the story takes place at Christmas time. A fractured family has gathered at this big ramshackle kind of crumbling mansion on the coast of Maine to celebrate Christmas with their matriarch, Miriam, who has dementia and is pretty certainly going to be dead by the next year. So, in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve, Miriam slips out of the house, walks onto the frozen reach, the frozen bay between the coast and an island, and she falls to the ice and she dies. And so there's this question, it was a terrible accident, or was it? We don't know. So in the present day, Miriam's granddaughter, Delphine, begins to investigate her grandmother's death. She's convinced that maybe something untoward happened, that it was something more than an accident. And then you also have a second timeline that's interwoven with that one, and that's of Miriam between the ages of, I guess it's like 13 and 35, as you find out the story of how she came to live in this big old mansion called the Whispers, and the things with her family that happened there, and how she ended up falling in love there and making a series of choices that ended up being really devastating, really destructive, and that would haunt her for the rest of her life. So as I began writing Miriam's sections, and I got really into the idea that Miriam's memory, her timeline would be written in present tense, while Delphine's would be written in like close past tense, more like a diary. So you'd really inhabit one moment, but then you'd be hearing about another. what I discovered was that these stories really lived in conversation with each other. And, as you noted, there are all these echoes, like you'll be in the present seeing something, and then you'll be in the past seeing the same thing, or something happens in the past that helps you understand more about what happened in the present. And that was a really exciting kind of discovery to make in the writing, that these stories could echo back and forth. They could play off each other. They could live in conversation with each other. And it could make the entire story richer for the reader, who has the benefit of both perspectives, whereas the characters do not.
Yeah. It's interesting because while the timelines are, it made sense, and there is these echoes. I was also thinking about, like, kind of, I think you had mentioned it the last time we talked, that this one kind of is sort of fits in the whole, like, it's like a kind of gothic kind of mystery kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe not like officially, but it's more in that world.
No, it is. It's gothic.
And like, you definitely get that feel to it, which again is very different from the other book, which was great. I was a little curious. I was like, oh, I wonder how she's gonna do this. And so the writing is obviously really good, but how is that just kind of writing it in a kind of different genre or different kind of style or mode than the previous one? I mean, the previous one is very much the kind of like, who killed who or whatever, and there's the twist and all that, and this book has a elements of that too, but different genre wise. So what was it? Did you feel like hamstrung by that, or feel more open by that, or how was it kind of writing in a different style?
I mean, it's always very freeing to start fresh. And I have sort of avoided writing series or serially for that reason. There's this thing that Stephen King does where, his books all take place in and around Maine, which, I'm starting to do the same thing. Sorry, Stephen, stealing your thunder.
Well, I will say I've been to Maine 3 times, and I have stayed at Bar Harbor twice, and I've been all the way up into the middle part of the state and all up in the coast in Portland. And so that definitely was helpful. I don't know if people that haven't been there, I'm sure they could still get a feel of like what it's like, but having been literally to where the book takes place was, I don't know, it definitely came more alive for me, because I was like, yeah, I know what this is like. I know that the terrain and how it is over there. And like, in the winter, I've been there in the winter, like there's definitely a vibe. There's a feel to it there. So it definitely comes out that way when you write it.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. I mean, it's a sense of place is a big deal for me. It's one of the things that I want to imbue most strongly into all of my storytelling. So hearing from somebody who has been to Maine that it rang true is very gratifying to me. So, and what was the original? Oh, you're talking about genre. starting fresh. So, Stephen King does this thing where he sets his books in the same general, like, location, and then sometimes characters from one story will pop up in another. There's a sense that they all inhabit the same world, and I really like that. And I would like to, assuming that I get to continue doing this, maybe find ways to weave characters from previous stories into future stories. But I like a self-contained narrative. I like the idea that you slip into these characters' lives and you spend some time with them, and then you leave them and they've changed, and maybe so have you.
Yeah, it does. It's almost like a kind of, I guess people, when they feel that way about, I don't know, certain stories they latch onto, it does feel like it's, it's a part of you. It's like, yeah, I know these people, or I know their world, or I'm kind of, whatever, like they could be in my neighborhood or something like that. And so I do think that is nice to kind of have those elements in the story. You write, I'm curious about this. You mentioned it in the beginning, that in the previous book and in this book, there's strong female protagonists, right? Mm-hmm. But you do it in a way that's, I don't know how to describe it. It's not like in this, it's not like a trope, like a girl power kind of like, yeah, like, I can kick ass and do anything. I mean, there's elements of that in there, but it's not so like performative, or it's not like so like, here's the messaging I want you to get from this story. It's like a kind of, I don't know, an authenticity there. And I guess going to the first part that you were saying about like how you're kind of culture writing and things that you do and essays you do, do kind of show up in your novels and vice versa. And so is that kind of, having strong central female characters, but, building their characters in a kind of authentic, particular way, is that intentional, or is that just going to come out? Tell me about that.
It sounds like you're asking me, is it on purpose that women in your books are also people?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
They are. Yes. I do subscribe to the radical notion that women are people. And so, I try to, write women and men, with equal complexity. I think, that it is easy if you set out explicitly to write a quote unquote strong female character, which is like such a trope at this point, that there is a lot of pressure, to sometimes make them larger than life in the ways that you're describing. And also it's easy to get bogged down in these stereotypical kind of like badass girl power or whatever, rah-rah tropes that are in fact inherently one-dimensional and flattening, and the opposite of, I mean, they may be strong in one sense of the word, but like as a literary device, if you're talking about character building, they're the opposite of strong. They're flat and flimsy, and you can predict every last thing that they're going to do.
Yeah, it's interesting because, well, I guess I have a question kind of along that, but so how do you see them as just people, right? Not this flattening one-dimensional character. I mean, is it just, you just pull from, your ideas about, womanhood or what it means to be a female in the world, or from folks in your life, or how do you there's this trope and there are ways in which people do that. So how do you avoid that, or how do you do it in the way that you do it, I guess?
I mean, I use my imagination a lot, which I know is something that is bizarrely increasingly stigmatized in fiction writing. But no, I use my imagination. I spend a lot of time, sort of asking, well, what would it feel like to be this person? What would it be like to be this person? What would they do? When I'm dealing with certain personality types, I will oftentimes read a lot of first person accounts from people who've like had relationships with people like that. Or I'm just trying to think, like there was for this book, actually, I read a memoir by a therapist because I wanted to get a better sense of how a sort of like a lost 26-year-old might behave. Like I don't really have much in common with my protagonist with Delphine, at least in this book. She's, quite a bit younger than I am, and she's sort of at sea and without direction in a way that I haven't really been. And for those reasons, she kind of drove me crazy a lot. And I wanted to make sure that I was portraying her in a way that was compassionate and that made what she was doing understandable. Because a lot of the time, her behavior was kind of inscrutable even to me.
Is that has to be, I mean, I don't write stories, so I find it so overwhelming. I don't know. It's just not a gear I have. I think it's a talent that people can do that, but it must be nice to write a character and do research for it where I'm sure if characters are familiar, that's probably in some ways easier, maybe other ways not, but something that's so different there must be like a freedom to that. Like, yes, I'm going to do this, as much as I want and just go with it and see where the character takes you. Do you find like freedom in writing characters that are different than you or very opposite, or how does it feel like, writing that way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things, a lot of writers will say, oh, my characters talk to me. And I don't really think I've ever had that experience. It honestly sounds a little bit terrifying. I hope that my characters never start talking to me. But they do sometimes surprise me. I'll be in a scene with one of them, either like in this person's head or watching from a third person perspective, writing and watching as they do something. And then something will happen, I mean, it'll be my idea, but it feels like it's come from this person who doesn't exist. It's like, of course, this is what they're going to do or say now. And sometimes that's really surprising and delightful.
Mm.
And sometimes it's like, no, don't do that. Oh, well, you have to. It serves the plot.
Yeah, I think it's interesting where I've people that have written screenplays or other people that have written novels, they'll say certain things where it's like, how does this fit with the plot or the arc of the character? But then, breaking some of those conventions and maybe doing it this way, or and I always wonder how people kind of feel when they're making those characters or whatever. So I guess while we're talking about this in particular, I read you have to be familiar with this term. I read a article, I was trying to find it, about this colloquial term used for women in film, at least, called a type of Mary Sue character. Have you heard of this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, and so well, maybe explain to listeners what it is and what your thoughts are on it, and yeah.
Okay, so Mary Sue, I haven't done my homework on this, so I'm just going to give you the kind of like the definition that lives in my head, which I think is pretty close to the official definition. It's a character that's basically a self-insert for the author, and the character can sort of do no wrong. Yeah. They're so good and they're so pure, and if bad things happen, it's never their fault. Mm-hmm. They're often incapable of making mistakes, so like bad things may happen to them, but they never cause anything bad to happen. They're just too infallible.
Yeah, and so some of the criticism that some people have said is that, well, what we're seeing, if I think for a long time in film or in sometimes in fiction, but in film or in television shows, you always had this trope of like a kind of how women characters are. They're always ancillary, they're very minor, they don't have a lot of speaking time, they're fitting a kind of traditional role or whatever. And now there's a kind of aspect where we've gone the other way with this kind of characterization where it's almost too perfect, where it's like people use the example of like Captain Marvel. Like she has no conflict necessarily, right? Like they tried to force it, but it was like she's automatically powerful and can do everything, and there's no one can beat her, and it's like there's no really internal or even external conflict that she has to deal with. Now, some people might fight me on that. Some people say Rey in Star Wars was the same way. There was no real, it was like, oh, who are my parents? But like, it wasn't, she had all these powers automatically. And, she's the granddaughter of, the emperor and all these things. And so it's just like, it was never her doing something. It was just like, yeah, bad things would happen around her, or her parents left, or whatever it was. But like, just too perfect. And I don't know. I mean, do you buy that we see a lot of that in film or in shows, that like these characters that are just, instead of having all these horrible stereotypes, now we have these things where like in film, they're just, really good. Nothing really they don't do anything wrong. They're too perfect. Do you buy that, or how do you see it?
I think it's a thing. I think it's a criticism that is levied more often than is actually fair. I think people just kind of say that a lot of the time. Like, for instance, Rey, I would never describe her as a Mary Sue. She's profoundly flawed, impulsive, hubristic in many ways. And, she very intentionally does not close this portal that she has, between her mind and shirtless Adam Driver's. She could have shut that down, and she didn't. Because there was something about it.
Shirtless Adam Driver is hard to shut down. Come on now.
I wouldn't close that goddamn portal either. No, I wouldn't.
Cut her some slack.
No, I'm saying, I think, that makes her very relatable. She does have flaws.
Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that. I think I always liked the character of Rey. I don't like what the film kind of did with her, but I think the character was a pretty strong character. I liked her story. I thought it was interesting. But some people have with her leveled that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Star Wars was a disaster in general, for, so many reasons that had nothing to do with Rey's character. Interestingly, Rose Tico is probably much more of a Mary Sue than Rey is. And,
yeah.
I think that a lot of the poor response to that character, although it was often attributed to, anti-Asian sentiment. I think that it had at least as much to do with the fact that she just was a badly drawn, kind of a flat character.
Yeah, I think that, again, there's a lot of problems with the sequel trilogy, which, I won't get into a tangent on here, but I just wonder sometimes where you see it with, all the million superhero films or even other films where it's like, it seems like many times there's things are very plot driven, which isn't necessarily bad, but like it almost seems hard to find in mainstream, film or shows, good characters that have a lot of complexity and a lot of dynamics and a lot of interesting things going on, as opposed to, well, you just fit here and then that's it, or you're representing this idea or this messaging or this, construct, and then that's it. There's nothing. I never find it really having depth like other stories or other films have as well. Do you see that as well, or no? Am I wrong on this?
No, I think that's very true. And, that owes, at least in part, to we're talking about the superhero genre specifically. That's not necessarily a place in which you're going to get a lot of moral complexity. You're not going to get really complicated characters. I think that maybe the thing is, it's very difficult to write a layered character. And we talk about this more for whatever reason when it comes to female characters. I think we get kind of hamstrung in these conversations. And I flashed for a moment on Game of Thrones, where there's a sense that like your female characters need to be complex and rich and strong, but they also they can't be immoral in certain ways because that makes it misogynistic. Like if a woman is bad, then you're saying that women are bad or can be bad, hence you must hate women. And what I flashed on Game of Thrones because of the character of Khaleesi, who is, she's very complex and she takes quite a turn, which you should have and could have seen coming a mile away. Nevertheless, it is a shocking descent into madness and mayhem there at the end. Sorry if I'm spoiling Game of Thrones for anyone, but, that at least was that was a hell of an arc. It was rich. It was layered. It made logical sense, in terms of what kind of a person she was and had been kind of shown to be over the course of all of this time that you'd spent with her. And people got really upset. They got really upset that it was, for her to go crazy and power mad at the end, that this was misogynistic because it made her bad. And, people wanted to root for her and they took that away. And that was so sexist and wrong. So I think that basically, what I'm saying in a long-winded way is that we get bogged down in this conversation when it comes to female characters because we're trying to reconcile a lot of forces that can't be reconciled, a lot of kind of competing desires.
Yeah, I also was thinking of Game of Thrones too, maybe because it's, we've had a little bit of time away from it, at least from the original series. And I don't know. I totally agree with everything you're saying. I know people liked Daenerys and everything. I just never really did. I just don't. I found her really obnoxious. But my favorite character in the show is oh my God, why am I drawing a blank on her name? The Queen.
Cersei?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's great.
she's my favorite because she was super complex. She had a lot of stuff going on, and it felt in some ways relatable. In other ways, it's like, yeah, I know you're like the antagonist of sorts, but I can almost sympathize with you. Like, yeah, maybe I would do the same thing or consider that in this moment, or, there's certain, there's an edge to her. And the fact that she could use power in a way, it was a nice, I will say it was a nice contrast with Daenerys for sure. It was a way of, here's how we're going to use our power and here's how we're going to control certain things going on, and here's how our relationships with men are going to be or not going to be, or it was really, really interesting. I think was it Littlefinger as well, right? Is that the name? Yeah, I think that's the character's name. The guy that was the real shifty guy that was always like kind of, you didn't know what side he was on. I thought was
Oh yeah.
super interesting as well. I don't know. I mean, I get it. I mean, I thought Jon Snow was a terrible character. It was an absolutely hollow, flat, boring character. It was so boring.
Yeah, he's a bit of a Mary Sue.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I felt nothing. When he died, I felt nothing. Spoiler alert. He got resurrected. I felt nothing. I felt nothing. I was like, why are we giving this guy screen time? I don't know. I think maybe it's sometimes with creators or really the person that's creating characters, it's like, how are you choosing to tell a story about a person? And sometimes some things are more character focused and plot focused, but like, if you look at, Chris Nolan's Batman trilogy, really complicated characters, how he chose to talk about, Batman in a certain way, how he talked about Bane, how he talked about, I guess Catwoman, right? Yeah. All these characters are complex, even if they're the anti-hero or the protagonist or even the antagonist. So maybe it just comes down to how people are trying to tell stories about relationships in a way. How are they trying to tell about someone's psychology? How are they trying to understand certain emotions or how we relate with other people? And, I think sometimes it is interesting though, seeing people's reactions to certain things. Sometimes people like the kind of, cartoon version of characters. This is very one-dimensional. Yes, give it to me easy. Tell me everything I need to know. Give me the good stuff at the end. And then that's it. And it's almost like this familiar kind of thing almost. I don't know. I mean, do you think that happens a lot more than... I don't know. I don't want to sound old, but like that's not how movies used to be in some ways, or I don't know. I mean, do we see more of that now, or am I just being jaded?
No, I think that you're onto something in terms of what is kind of out there, and what kind of stories are out there. And I'm just thinking about, there's like a bunch of different threads that I feel like I want to pull on at one time. But I guess maybe one of the big things is that there's very little happening now that is genuinely original. One of the big things right now is that like you go to the movies and chances are that you're going to be spending time with characters who you already have met in some capacity before. We keep going back to the same well with storytelling, where you're hanging out with the same people. And so I think that maybe for sure in like, when by the time you get to Avengers 4, how much character development are you still doing? Like, right. We all know, we know who these people are. We've been hanging out with them. We know how they're going to behave. Like, there's very little left to be revealed about them character-wise. And so then it becomes plot-driven. And, a lot of what's on now is plot-driven.
I totally agree with what you're saying about, it does seem we're going to the same well for stories. And that's why I think when we get stuff that is truly original and it has or elements of it, it's nice to kind of really, pitch into that or talk about that or say what are they trying to say? What are they trying to do? And there are certainly some filmmakers that are doing that. I mean, I think The Lighthouse was really interesting. It was a kind of like an art house film, a film noir.
Yeah.
But it was cool.
I had to Google that and like read a lot about the myths that it was based on, because that was a movie where I ended it with an impression, but I was like, I'm missing something. I want to know more about this. And that's always very enjoyable to have questions afterwards and to go back in and try to re-understand it from another perspective. Yeah.
I like when there's so many films I've seen recently that have been really, really, really good. I mean, I really enjoyed the movie Tar, which is a fantastic film. And I don't know, there's people that are doing really good stuff out there. So I think it's, is it going to be making, $1.5 billion at the box office? Probably not. But, I think it's good to invest in people that are telling good stories with good characters and things like that. I have to ask you a few things about culture. There's the never-ending culture wars. Of course, you write about this stuff too, and so I guess the one piece I really liked. I like a lot of your pieces, but the one piece I really liked because I've gotten this too, which is I guess I don't really care, but it is a little obnoxious though, because it feels, I don't know, it's just annoying. You wrote this piece for National Review. God forbid you write something for a conservative outlet. On what was the title? Why am I confused with the Republican? What is it called?
Why I keep getting mistaken for a conservative.
Yeah. So I mean, people. I'll post a link to the article, but just tell us about your kind of thoughts about that and why that kept happening. Is it because you were on Gutfeld, or was it because you've been on all these, you talk to conservatives and you're not telling them how they're the oppressors of all of human race or whatever? I mean, what is it about it that kind of made you want to write this piece and to talk about it?
So a National Review commissioned this piece from me based on sort of an awkward but funny interaction that I had with their executive editor, Rich Lowry. And this meeting that he and I had, this lunch, is the introduction to the piece. It frames the piece. So he emailed me and said, I would like to take you to lunch. And I have a policy that, like, if you invite me to lunch, I just say yes. Especially if the other person is paying.
Hey, why not? Right? Yeah.
So I'm just kind of a yes to everything. This is my professional strategy. If I sense that there might be, like a possibility to do paid work, or just a useful connection to be made, sure. And also like if you're like, hey, come eat food, I'll pay. I love to eat food. Mm-hmm. So I said yes to this lunch. We set a date. I asked no further questions. I think that maybe this was like intuitive on my part, because had I inquired too deeply, this lunch might actually have never happened. Because what happened was, went to lunch, and I'm sitting there, and I've long since finished my tuna tartare, and Rich Lowry had not yet told me what I was doing there, and it was starting to get a little weird. And I finally said, "Look, I don't want to make this awkward, but why am I here?" And he said, "This is awkward. I was going to ask you about becoming a columnist for National Review, but apparently you're a liberal." And I laughed and I said, "This is not the first time this has happened to me." And he said at the time, that would be a pretty interesting topic for an essay. And then a couple months later, I got an email from, another editor at the National Review, and via this thing called the Pacific Fund, which is some kind of like grant or enterprise. I don't really know the details, but National Review is able to commission pieces, journalism and essays and so on that are not really entirely in the National Review wheelhouse, that are a little different. And my essay was one of these. So I wrote 4,000 words about my kind of political trajectory, the principles that I hold dear, and how those have, sort of without me changing much of anything about myself. If anything, the earth has shifted under my feet so that now I'm seen by some stupid people. No, not stupid. Assumptive people, as being a member of the political right, which I'm really very much not in any meaningful sense of the word. You were saying, why do I think this happens to me? I think that it has a lot to do with what I've termed oppositional defiant disorder in the culture, where basically nobody really defines your politics anymore based on what your principles are, what you stand for, or even who you vote for. Instead, they define it based on who you hate. And if you don't appear to hate anybody, then they'll look to see who hates you and reverse engineer it from there. Mm-hmm. So, I am a culture writer. Culture is a very left-dominant place. Most of the weird cultural excesses that make for good essay fodder are coming from the left. And so I spend a lot of time writing analytically and, yes, critically about stuff that's happening on the political cultural left. usually from a feminist perspective. And as a result, some of the kind of shriekingest progressive people on the internet are often really angry at me and, kind of whipping up a lot of unhappiness in my Twitter notifications. And I think that people look at this and they say, well, they're all mad at her, hence she must be one of the other team's players. Mm-hmm. But I'm not.
Mm-hmm. But okay, two questions here. Is it bad or is it a wrong thing if you were on the right? I mean, that's not a bad thing.
No, not at all.
I mean,
no, the thing that I keep saying is that, like, I'm not upset that people think I'm a conservative. I just think it's weird in the same way that I would think it was weird if somebody thought that I was a natural blonde. It's like, why? Where would you get the
For those that haven't seen what Kat looks like, she is very much a brunette. So, I don't understand. I do agree with you about the reverse engineering piece of it. It is like if you're getting hate from one side, then everyone's like, oh, you must be, on that other side's team or whatever. And I could see that, but it's a strange thing for me. But I also feel when I was reading the piece and I was thinking about it, I was like, I mean, again, I've read your stuff. I see you online. I'm like, yeah, she's definitely not a conservative. She's not woke. She's not progressive, like in a labeling way. I mean, but definitely she's not conservative. But I guess the thing is it's always this like allegiance thing, which is frustrating, which is really frustrating. Like, it's like, I mean, you and I probably voted similar our entire adult lives. No, I mean, I've never voted for a Republican. I mean, I've voted.
Yeah, same.
I've voted Democrat or independent my whole life. And I don't understand. And if you were to sit down and ask me, what do you, I'm just like, it's a strong centralized federal government. And, I've voted for people that want to believe in universal health care. And, I've got all these things. I don't understand why people would say, because I had a conversation with someone that does X, Y, and Z on the right, all of a sudden I have an allegiance there. Is that where you see it as well? It's like, if I have a conversation or if I do a piece or if I talk to people that have some pretty wild views or really, really extreme on one end, all of a sudden you're on their team. Is it kind of like this allegiance thing that you feel that people misconstrue?
I think that's part of it. I mean, I mentioned this in the piece. I came out as the wife of he's not a Republican anymore, but he was when I met him. I'm married to one of them. This is right. I actually kept this like not exactly secret, but kind of for a really long time, because I did sense that, talking about it openly would bring down a certain amount of ugliness on me, and in a way that was personal and that involved my husband, sure. Who was a wonderful man, and who I didn't think that was fair to him. And, sure. Indeed, like when the piece came out, I had decided that I was okay at this point. Like, we've been married almost 15 years. I would go ahead and like write a tiny bit about this. But people said really, really deeply ugly things. Is it about who you affiliate with, who you spend your time with? And I think that, yes, that is probably a part of it. For me also, because I'm on the left. I'm in a kind of a professional and personal and social bubble where people are mostly on the left, at least online. In real life, most of my friends are just really not political creatures, which is nice. Mm-hmm. But I think, the other thing is that being willing to speak or write critically about things that are on the left, or even just willing to be irreverent about them, which is kind of a big thing for me. Like, I will make a joke about anything. Mm-hmm. I think it's funny. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is not received well, especially in progressive spaces. There, the one thing that they do kind of above all else is take themselves extremely seriously. And so if you aren't like that, even if it's just that you're not wired that way, it's seen as inherently threatening, that to make fun of this, to laugh about it, to find the humor in it, or to be, thoughtfully critical of it is all akin to just giving ammunition to the other team.
Yeah, I find the same thing, and it's really frustrating. Where it's like, look, I mean, I'm all for certain aspects of social justice in the true sense of the word, like I'm about advocating for better rights for people and all those things. But it's like I don't want to do that all the time. Like I don't want to like always 24/7 my online presence, what I write about, what I think about, who I talk to always be about that. And it's one of those things where it's really frustrating, where it's like, it's okay if other people want to do that, but I don't know. It feels that way, right? You can be in other spaces with people that are kind of quote unquote apolitical or independent, and they're not doing that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that's fine. That's fine to do that sometimes. But I mean, sometimes you got to not take yourself seriously and just take a day off. I mean, that's what I feel doesn't happen. And so I was going to ask about what was the reception to that piece, but you've kind of said that it was kind of the usual bullshit, right? Of people just attacking you ad hominem and all these other things. Yeah.
I mean, it was mixed. So, the people who didn't read it, who just don't like me for whatever reason, they, of course, said ugly and nasty things, either to me or about me. And I was very much anticipating that. But the really overall response to the piece was so incredibly positive. And I got so many messages from people on both sides of the political aisle saying, I feel this, you're speaking to my own experiences. I have been in exactly that place. And it was very interesting to me. I did catch like a little bit of wind of this as I was researching the piece. I talked to some folks on the political right who said that they had experienced something like this with respect to like their lack of support for Trump from Republican family members, who said, well, like you're a traitor or whatever. But it really was brought home to me once the piece came out, how much this is not a phenomenon that's specific to either, any one political side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is that has to be really encouraging to hear, because it's like the people that probably really matter, the people that are saying like this really resonated. You're always going to get the nasty, vile stuff, but if you're really connected with people, I think that's super rewarding. I mean, I think that's what's really, really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where sort of, any kind of actual progress in the original sense of the word, and collaboration and problem solving, that's where it's going to happen. Everybody who had a cruel response to this piece, it was the equivalent of them like writing it on the wall in a bathroom somewhere, like where they see it and their friends see it, and yay, you get to feel like you really got one over on me, whatever. But it just doesn't ultimately matter, not in the way that these kinds of connections with people who, who are coming at disagreements in good faith and with a desire to, collaborate and compromise and find an actual solution. Like that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. Well, before I let you go, my last question for you is it's 2023. It's a new year. It
is? Jesus.
Yeah, I know, right?
I thought it had been 2020 for 3 years.
For 3
That's
years,
really what it felt like.
That's kind of what it does feel like in some days, yes. You have obviously a new book out. I'm sure you have a lot of other things in the works. But the one last question I want to ask you is, it has been a rough couple of years, for I think a lot of folks. But when I was thinking back about all the things that we as a society or as a culture worried about and talked about, it 90% of it feels irrelevant, right? Like I don't care about Joe Rogan's podcast everyone was talking about. I don't care about Chappelle's jokes. I don't care about all of these things that get hot for a couple of weeks and then we forget about it. And the frustrating thing is that people really care. They really care. And I don't want to give this a lot of oxygen. So I'm just at the end here, we just, final thoughts on it. But it's people really care about Elon Musk and owning Twitter and what his Twitter presence does. And I just wonder for this year and as we do things or just in general, where do you think, culture is going to still do what it does? But are we ever going to get past this thing of like, oscillating from, whatever's hot for 2 or 3 weeks and then moving on to the next outrage and the next outrage and the next outrage? Or is that just going to keep happening You know, why? I mean, I bring up Musk because it just feels dumb to me. Like, I just don't understand why people care. It's a rich billionaire that bought a social media platform. Like, go fucking outside and take a walk. Like, who cares? I don't understand. People are like making their, you know, proclamations. I'm leaving in T-3 days, you know, 19 hours. And I'm like, just leave then if you don't want to be on here. Why are you making this big, like, to do? Here's my other account here. Like, if I want to find you, I'll find. I don't understand. Like, I don't have a lot of followers. Like, whatever. Maybe for people that really do have a lot of followers, it is a big deal or something. But even still, like, why do we? That's not. There is so many things in your personal life that should be more important than who the fuck owns Twitter. Why is that like this a thing for people? Are they just bored? And are we going to keep doing this all year? Like, worried about things that I don't think are really consequential? People complain for me that I'm way too dismissive about stuff, and maybe I am. But what are your thoughts on this? I guess.
I mean, I think, you know, having observed the Twitter discourse on Twitter about Twitter, and the participants in it who were expressing the types of sentiments that you've just been cataloging, you know, like the ones who were really freaking out about it. I think that stems in large part from a sense that Elon Musk like came into their special clubhouse and he took their, you know, no boys allowed sign off the door and put up a different one that said everyone is allowed. You know, there's just, I think a lot of like the most kind of mysterious angst about this is not that mysterious, because it's really just people who felt like they had a nice little club here, and now here comes somebody who's going to like make them invite the smelly kid to their birthday party when they didn't want to, and you know, he's mucking up the joint. Mm-hmm. And that sense of like ownership over Twitter when, you know, they didn't own it, somebody else did. Right. Yeah, you know, I don't know. I'm trying not to get too much of a kick out of it, but it is, as you said, it's so over the top. It's just a spectacle, you know, to watch people having these meltdowns about this website, but never actually leave the website, which is really funny.
They never leave it. I go on. One day I was like checking out somebody. I was like, wasn't this person like talking for like weeks that they were going to leave? I'm going to leave. And I'm like, you don't need to make, it's not a formal announcement. Like it just feels like in some ways such a like meta moment of like what people do all the time when they have this kind of performative outrage, where it's like, mm-hmm. Yes, there are some things that like maybe, you know, aren't, you know, certain people might offend certain people, or it's like, you know, sticking your finger in someone's eye and like, okay, like I get it, but it's not, we don't need to like have like a CNN breaking news alert, you know, of like, you know, so-and-so told a really horrible joke. It's like, don't watch the special. Don't go to this. I just don't. And like, this just feels like more of that, where it's just like, yeah, you know, this guy that we don't like is inviting all the other kids we don't like, and they're taking a shit in the corner. It's like, okay, like, yeah, that sucks. I get it. But like, I don't know. I just.
That was our corner to shit in.
Yeah, that was our corner, right? Yeah, I can trash the place. You can't trash the place. I just don't. I don't know. But I feel like sometimes, you know, I'm like, is it a big deal? Like, is it not? Maybe it is. Maybe it is a big deal. I don't know.
So I actually have thoughts about Twitter being, and the kind of recent events happening on Twitter being a big deal for the reason that Twitter has a very disproportionate level of influence over the national conversation because of who congregates there. It's not the most popular platform, but the people who do use it have a disproportionate amount of weight when it comes to like the size of their platforms, where, you know, how much their voices get heard, how responsible they are for setting the tone and deciding kind of what all of the rest of us are talking about. You know, every place that culture is made, those power brokers, those tastemakers, they're all on Twitter. They're all talking. They're all, you know, shaping the stuff that the rest of us consume. So on that front, I think that what happens on Twitter is unfortunately important culturally, and is going to continue to be unless the site sees a huge demographic shift. On that front, it was interesting to me, and this is, I think, you know, my takeaway from the Twitter files, which have been dropping, you know, for the past month or so. is that this is not just my opinion, but it's the opinion of the American government. And we've seen that, folks in the FBI and in two separate presidential administrations decided that what was happening on Twitter was important enough that they needed to step in and apply pressure to try to get Twitter to censor the voices of individual American citizens. As a super free speech liberal person, that to me is interesting and probably not great.
Yeah.
And I think it's definitely worth talking about. But that's a separate thing from, oh no, Elon Musk owns Twitter. It's maybe the closest analogy I can think is that, say you have a restaurant that you really like to go to and you get special treatment there and, the food's not great, but it's your place. And then it changes ownership and, everything is the same. The food's still not great, but now also you don't get special treatment because the new owner doesn't know who you are or doesn't like you or doesn't care about you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of feels, definitely like that. And I do agree with you about the Twitter files thing. And so, yes, there's definitely some legitimate concerns there, right? And I do agree that Twitter does have an impact in shaping culture and society and things like that. Obviously, the most popular platform probably is TikTok, right? Isn't that the most popular one at this point?
I guess so. I'm afraid of it. I won't go near that one.
I don't understand it, so I don't get it. It's too much stimulus for like 10 seconds. I don't.
One second you go on TikTok, the next thing you know, you're dancing in ugly jeans. Not happening.
I don't really get it. But I just wish people were less outraged, but
yeah, the outrage is a separate thing. I think it can. I think that everyone is getting, or like normal people at least, which most of us are, everyone's getting exhausted. They're just tired of the everything has to be turned up to 11 at all times. Every election, democracy is on the line. Yeah. Leaving aside the boy who cried wolf aspect of all of that, it's just not sustainable to, crank up the sort of national fear and anxiety as high as it'll go and then just keep it there. People will eventually be like, I'm too tired to be scared.
Well, yeah, most people, what they do is they just check out. And that's not a good thing entirely. Maybe for some things we shouldn't give things too much energy, but I think for other things, it's like, no, you should still be involved. But right, people don't. I've had a conversation with this with a few people, and where I come on this is like, when I talk to my progressive friends, I say, I care about this issue. You care about it at an 11. I care about it at a 6. We both care about it. I just don't care about it like that. And I can't do that 24/7. But don't say I don't care about it. Right. I do care. Here's where I have cared about. I just don't care about it that way. And so, maybe my thing is, I don't know, gerrymandering. I'm like super boring and that's really important to me. I think that's, I really do get worked up about that. But sure, maybe your thing is, climate change. That's fine. I care about climate change, but I'm not, there's just different degrees of these things. And so maybe we can get into a space where people can kind of turn down their knobs of sorts, but, we'll see.
I think so. The fact that, we are slowly but surely creeping out of our little caves that we've been living in for the past 3 years and spending more time with other people. This was something that the pandemic really brought home for me was that, investing in your relationships is important. And, I've been doing a lot more socializing, post 2020, even when it was maybe a little dicey to leave your house. But valuing that and making it a priority in a way that I didn't beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Same for me too. I it's one of those things when it's gone, you're like, wow, I don't want that to happen again. Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you're super busy and you have all the promotional stuff. So the last thing
I so appreciate you having me on.
Of course.
Ask me the last thing.
Yeah. I was really happy to get you on again. I love you. Like I said, I love your writing. And so I was, you were very kind to send me the book and, I read it probably in a weekend. And so I think most listeners can as well. It's called You Must Remember This. It's super good. It's a perfect novel for any time, but definitely during the winter. It has a nice, good winter feel to it. I think the other one had a nice autumn feel. Maybe it's just when they're coming out. I don't know, but they're always good to read. Really, really good storytelling. And so tell people where they can find your work online. I know you write at Unheard, and where else? Where do you write?
Yeah, so all of my work I post on Twitter. That's where my sort of my main promotional hub. I'm also on Instagram. Both places, it's just my name, Kat Rosenfield. Yeah, you can find me pretty much every week at Unheard. You can find me writing at Reason, and you can find You Must Remember This anywhere that you would buy a book. Local bookstores, BNN, Amazon, wherever you care to do it. Local library. It all helps.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I hope everyone gets out there and buys it. It's a great story, and that they follow your writing and all the good stuff that you're writing about. And so I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your process and about culture and about characters, and all of it has been, just so wonderful to talk about. So I appreciate it.
I appreciate you inviting me, and I apologize for all of the pet interruptions.
You're totally fine. Alrighty, thank you.